Welcome to Church History for Chumps. My name is John Simon.
And I'm Thomas Duell.
And we're real happy to have you all here today. So we're ready to talk some more church history. You know what I realized, dude? So when we named Church History for Chumps, I liked using the word chump because there's the alliteration, there's that double ch sound, which is cool. And I googled it because I was like, I don't really know. I mean, I assume a chump is like a goober, like a silly goose. Turns out the dictionary definition is a chump is someone foolish, stupid, or gullible, and that that's not what I think of you if you're listening to this. I hope you know that.
I think I knew that's what chumps
I knew it was it wasn't like a sage, church history for sages.
Yeah.
But I mean, I figured it was like a goofy, maybe not like a scholar.
It's taken on its own thing now, though,
Yeah.
I feel like the church history for chumps is it's just the name of the podcast.
Yeah.
And that's what,
Yeah.
Some people call it CH4C. Most people say, your podcast to me. They don't say I have been listening to Church History for Chumps.
That's a mouthful. It is a mouthful.
Yeah.
I hope the Chump Cast will one
I was
day.
about to say that. I feel like we need to get that
I hope
going.
that'll get rolling.
Welcome back to the Chump Cast.
Welcome back to the Chump Cast. Speaking of the Chump Cast, little shout out. We've been doing shout outs lately. I like to do a shout out to heavy Christian music. I've been getting back into it lately.
Really?
Man. Yeah. I was going through hip hop for the past 12 years, and I just realized driving to work one day, I was like, this is not my lifestyle. I've never sold crack in the whip, that's not where I'm at. And I listened to a ton of heavy music. There's actually, this is a story for another time, but a lot of a cool overlap between listening to heavy Christian music and my testimony. When I first became a believer, this was like a really, really big encouragement for me, was getting into music that just felt like it matched the turmoil of my spiritual state. But I've just been getting back into it lately.
I'm so mad at John MacArthur.
Yeah, so I don't know. Shout out to that. Shout out to August Burns Red, Becoming the Archetype.
Just Fit for a King and Devil Wears Prada are playing the Rialto next Friday.
Next Friday?
Yeah.
Ah, freaking crap, dude.
Yeah, I got something else too.
Yeah. Dang, that'd be cool. I still haven't seen The Devil Wears Prada. I was going to ask you,
Not that they're exactly the quintessential Christian band, but...
yeah. Who is anymore? Yeah. Probably August Burns Red. Maybe Haste the Day. I haven't listened to Devil Wears Prada since... what is it? As Roots Above.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah. Where should I jump back? Oh, no, I did listen to the Zombie EP.
Okay. You definitely need Dead Throne.
Yeah.
Is probably my favorite album by them.
Okay.
818's really good.
Okay.
The second Zombie album that they did is
pretty good.
They did a second one?
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
A couple of their albums since they feel very different than kind of traditional Devil Wears Prada, and so it's kind of like a song by song whether or not I like it.
Okay.
Also, they really aren't, I wouldn't classify them as a Christian band anymore.
Sure.
But Dead Throne. If you didn't ever listen to that album,
I'm excited now. Yeah. Dude, I listened to Plagues so much when I was in high school. I think every song was my top listened to song of all time.
That's awesome.
When I used iTunes. And dude, when I was driving back and forth to seminary up in Phoenix, if I was having a particularly long day and I just needed a jolt to get me awake, I'd put on Plagues and I'd feel like I could drive to freaking Massachusetts.
I'm gonna risk this episode getting taken down for copyright infringement, but
okay.
Let's see here.
Are you gonna play something from your phone right now? Yeah, all right. I'm sold. Yeah,
that's from Dead Throne.
All right. I'll check it out. Hey, let's get into our topic. We're at the 5-minute mark, and
Speaking
I'm worried people are stopped. Yeah,
let's talk about Anabaptists.
Oh my gosh. So yeah, to be we mentioned this a little bit earlier as we were chatting. We have been doing a heresies series. Anabaptists is a weird kind of in between because we can kind of see their ancestry all over the modern church world. So we don't want to call them outright heretics, but we also have to acknowledge that Anabaptists were kind of the wild child sect of the Reformation, right?
Yeah, and what we have, so there's a couple of movements today that would directly trace themselves to the Anabaptist movement, but are very different than
like
the
Southern
Anabaptists.
Baptist, yeah.
Well, very different than Southern Baptists, but also very different from the Anabaptists that were actually around at the beginning of the Reformation.
Okay.
So it's so complicated. I almost didn't want to do this episode because there's just so many different strings here, and it ties in with episodes we've done before. It ties in with episodes that we'll undoubtedly do in the future. But we got to start trying to scratch the surface somewhere on some of this stuff, because otherwise, we'll just never get there.
Yeah, we gotta start
There's
trial by fire.
so many things that happened in the first 50 years of the 1500s that were all happening at the same time, and they were interplaying with each other. Yeah, we gotta start chipping away at this iceberg.
Okay, all right. So let's start at the beginning. The Anabaptists.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So there's a few different views on where the Anabaptists came from or how they started. And just for starters, maybe we should define what Anabaptist means. So the word Anabaptist literally just means baptized again. And what, to maybe just give a brief overview, essentially at the time of the Reformation, you've got people in the various European countries and city-states all wrestling with this idea of what does the Reformation mean? What actually needs to be reformed?
Right.
And that is on a sliding scale from, I don't know, if we've got maybe, let's put Luther on one end,
Sure.
where it's actually pretty darn close to the Catholic Church as far as conformity and what needs to be reformed. I mean, some major changes, but functionally very, very similar.
Yeah.
On a sliding scale all the way. If Luther's on one side and you've got maybe Anglicans in the middle, or maybe Calvinists in the middle, you've got Anabaptists on the other side, which are saying borderline anarchist stuff sometimes. If we just need to throw the whole thing in the trash. But it kind of starts with baptism and whether or not your infant baptism was valid.
Okay. So I think to maybe set the table a little bit, this is if you're not familiar, this is from the Reformation. And the Reformation, if you're a Protestant, you know all about it. If you're a Catholic, you've probably been told lies about it, so listen up. But the Reformation was one of the most important events or series of events that would happen probably in the history of Western civilization, which is when a number of figureheads are going to start leading people outside of the Catholic Church and basically find ways to express the Christian faith that does not conform under the Bishop of Rome. This is happening in the 16th century, and something again that we were chatting about earlier is a lot of people think Martin Luther was he was the linchpin of all of this. And I think we even covered this in the past. That's not exactly true. Martin Luther is probably the most famous reformer because of his influence, his theology, and the role that he did play. But first, the people had been sharing sentiments of the reformers for hundreds of years at this point. Because if you look at Jan Hus, you look at the Lollards, you look at John Wycliffe, these are all people in very different geographical regions too, who were all starting to question the relationship that the church has with their political landscape and some theology they have. And the Reformation is going to be a wildfire that's going to go all across Europe. And Anabaptists are just one little branch of that, I guess. Is that a fair little summary, Thomas?
Yeah, I'd say so. In the grand scheme of history, I don't think the Anabaptists have nearly the influence or lasting legacy that the Lutherans, the Calvinists, the Reformed, the Catholics, all of those are pretty, big pieces of the theological landscape that we have today. Anabaptists don't really have that. And we'll talk later about whether or not Baptists are downwind of Anabaptists or not. It's actually, that's an interesting topic. But where they came from is very, I would say, problematic. So there's a couple different views, because there's people, obviously, when you've got this shifting tide from kind of the unity of the Roman Catholic Church, and people are starting to question, things like whether or not the Pope is like a real thing, whether or not indulgences should be used. How are we saved? Are we saved by faith alone, or is there some sort of works mixed in there? Whatever that may be.
And the relationship with the church and the magistrate was a big thing too,
right?
Like their relationship with property and just with like the public in general.
Exactly. So there's definitely people in a couple different European countries that around the same time are starting to question whether or not infant baptism is one of the things that needs to be reformed or not. So there is one view that would say that Anabaptists kind of spring up kind of dynamically over the European continent around the same time, partially because of humanist influences that are happening at the time as well. But there's one very verifiable, traceable origin that I would say is the most influential, and that actually has to do with Ulrich Zwingli. So Zwingli, if you don't know who he is, we definitely haven't had a pod on him yet, and we'll have a Zwingli episode for sure one time where we talk about Zwingli and his relationship with Martin Luther. But just imagine, like, if you can picture Germany on a map, even if you can't see how Germany fits into the European continent, just imagine, a country that's relatively Germany shaped, however you want to imagine it in your mind. Maybe it's shaped like a nice pitcher of beer,
Mine was schnitzel.
A round schnitzel with, some edges on it. Down kind of on the lower left side, you have Switzerland, and they share a border. They share a lot of, obviously, similar culture and language. So in Switzerland, there's a city called Zurich, and Zurich is, to give you an idea, like maybe 500 miles from Wittenberg, where Luther, is posting his 95 Theses, and it's only like 200 miles from Augsburg, which is an important city kind of in the Lutheran story of where Lutherans are defending their confession against the Holy Roman Emperor at the time. So very close proximity, and also Zwingli is teaching at the exact same time as Luther. So he's very much alongside Luther. They end up having some different ideas about a couple of things, in particular the sacraments and like what's the nature of Christ's work in the sacraments. But Zwingli is a reformer at basically the same time as Luther, but not in Germany, just in nearby Switzerland. And as Zwingli is teaching his doctrines and trying to reform the church in Switzerland, he has these young men that are following him and learning from him. And they're not only are they young men, like in their early 20s, but they're also recent converts. And so a couple key figures, a guy named Conrad Grebel, Felix Manz, and George Blaurock are these three students of Zwingli who they're kind of like they're kind of like the young, restless, and reformed version of the early Reformation, where they're just really on fire for this Reformation cause, and they've got these big ideas that kind of start to trend towards extremist ideas, and they start gathering along with maybe like 14 or 15 other people, and they are having meetings kind of outside of the teaching of Zwingli. And they eventually get to this, it comes to a head in 1525, which, to give you perspective, is only only 3 years after their leader, Conrad Grebel, has become a Christian. So he's a young man. He's a new convert.
I've seen this story before.
Yeah, we were just talking about this on our last episode.
Yeah.
Conrad is kind of going up against Zwingli, and the topic of infant baptism comes to a head because Conrad has a newborn baby named, I think her name was Isabella, and she hadn't been baptized yet. And remember, in order to understand the Anabaptist story and everything that's going to come downwind of this, is you need to remember that at this time in history, we're still on the tail end of Christendom, where there is a strong overlap between like the administration of the state and the church at the same time. So there's this edict basically where, he's commanded that, his infant needs to be baptized in accordance with the scriptures. And not only does he refuse, but on this night, I think it's in February of 1525, a winter night, they leave this meeting where he's been instructed that they have to baptize their infants. And these guys get together, and George Blaurock, one of the other kind of leaders of this movement, asks Conrad Grebel to baptize him on a profession of faith. And so this is like the first Anabaptism right here. So this guy George would have been baptized as an infant, and now he is going to be baptized as an adult.
Is it because George, like, did he just like come to like a belief? Like, did he lapse for a while and then kind of come back?
No, these guys were presumably raised, in the church.
Yeah.
Then as they're kind of entering into their 20s and they're really like starting to wrestle with their faith, they're studying under Zwingli, who's definitely challenging Roman authority. They're going one step farther and they're saying, well, we think infant baptism isn't in the Bible either. Oh,
I see. Yeah. So, and I didn't know. So Zwingli is pro infant baptism.
Yes, actually.
Okay. Yeah. That's really interesting, because the way that he and Luther would differ on the nature of the Lord's Supper, I kind of assumed that I kind of assumed that since most people today who would see the Lord's Supper as more less like animated and more of just like a symbolic thing, which was like Zwingli's lean, that maybe he was also like not a fan of children's baptism.
I don't know this for sure because I haven't studied Zwingli on baptism, but I'm fairly confident that Zwingli was pro infant baptism, but he had differences with Luther on what exactly was happening in that baptism.
Oh, that makes sense. That makes a lot of sense. Okay. But so these dudes are just straight up like, well, we don't think infant baptism is solid.
Right.
And we actually think, and it sounds like this dude wanted to be baptized because he felt like he had a firmer grasp on the faith than he would have as an infant, right?
Right. Yeah. They believed that you should only be baptized based on a profession of faith,
which is traditionally believers' baptism,
right?
Which is also very new to the church at this point.
There's nothing traditional about it at this point. Like this is very, very. We have to say it's extremist at this point for them to do what they did. They're kind of gathering in secret in this house, and they're like, please, why don't you baptize me on a profession of faith? And then that guy George turns around and he baptizes a few other people. And to us today, I grew up in a context going down to a mission trip in Mexico and seeing people who were 40 years old being baptized again in the ocean just because they wanted to like rededicate themselves. Like they've been baptized before. They've been walking with God as Christians for a while, and they're just like, why not do it again? Like, there's definitely in our American evangelical context, we have such a dim view of baptism that it might not sound that surprising to hear that somebody like felt this conviction like they needed to be baptized again. Yeah. But this really represents a complete divorce from really, I would argue, what has always been the teaching on baptism all the way from the apostles.
Yeah.
And what the Anabaptists are going to do is they're going to say, no, actually, everybody's had it wrong since then. We're the ones who are returning to the early church. We're recovering the original apostolic teaching, which is kind of how like every single Christian division and sect has always come about, right? Like,
sure,
nobody bags on the early church, right? Like everybody wants to claim them for their own cause. It's really a matter of whether or not you're right.
Oh yeah. And I think that if you ask a Catholic, they would say, well, this is the problem with the Reformation to begin with. Like, everyone felt like they had the authority to redefine what was true and to reinterpret the apostles to kind of fit their own thing. And I mean, obviously, as Protestants, I think that we definitely believe there was firm ground that the Reformers stood on and opposed the Catholic Church in. But when you look at the Anabaptists, like I think what I enjoy, and I think what were some of the other stories you're going to tell, Tommy, that I'm excited about, is the Anabaptists kind of show. It's a good reminder to the to the Protestants that it's not quite so simple, that the Reformation was just this beautiful, magnificent thing. Like, there was a lot of social and I'd say even theological unrest that the Reformation was going to reveal, and the Anabaptists are going to express that, because not only are they going to become theologically radical, they're also going to be a little wild. Like, there's going to be some crazy stuff going on. So yeah, it starts off, I mean, when you look at these first three guys, I can kind of sympathize with them a little bit because they do have this zeal, they do have this desire to be right, but they're also zealous, youthful guys that don't really understand the full implications of where they're going to take this, and their ideas are definitely going to be taken and some crazy stuff's going to happen. So kind of what happens first, it's contained within Zurich and within the broader scope of Switzerland for the most part. Although, remember, I was saying earlier, there's people with ideas like this kind of starting to crop up all over. So Zurich, where Zwingli is really influential, is the first place where they start to try to deal with it. And I think by the end of 1526, so about like a year and a half later, Zurich has now made it punishable by death to be running around and rebaptizing people. And wow,
again, if that sounds really like cringe or odd to you, you need to remember a few things, which is that, like I said, we're at the tail end of Christendom, where not only is there some overlap and bleeding into each other of the church and state, which, you know, there's solid critiques against that, but also the nature of Europe at this time, with all of these city-states and these countries, if they have people that are like fracturing the theological unity of like a place,
it's treason.
It's not only is it treason, but it could really put you in danger of being overrun by, you know, another country, another city-state,
right,
if you start to disintegrate. And so there's probably a little bit of a lesser of two evils calculus going on here, when if they're deciding to put to death people teaching these things, because it's not just like we think of theological convictions as like intellectual truths that we have in our heads, but for them, and I mean, you could argue that this is good for them, this has real implications on how they're going to be the whole fabric of like politics.
Yeah, just society.
Right.
Yeah.
So being an Anabaptist really was, in a way, like being a political anarchist.
Yeah. And dude, can I say, I don't want this to take us too far off our point here, but like the relationship that the church has had with martyrdom is so interesting to me, because I think I remember reading a quote from Marcus Aurelius where he was basically like, Christians are the most frustrating people in the universe because killing them makes them stronger. So when you tell me like, oh, well, Zwingli said that the Anabaptists were now doing something that was punishable by death, I'm like, that's not going to stop them.
No.
Like, that's going to make them stronger.
You're right. It is going to galvanize them. And I will say, it's not clear to me from what I did that this was necessarily Zwingli's choice to make it, but I don't think he necessarily like fought against it either. It's kind of like Augustine with the Donatists,
right? Or Calvin in Geneva. Like, he wasn't the head honcho, but the magistrate decided on this,
right? So so that's like at the end of 1526, and then one of the guys that I mentioned earlier, Felix Manz, he had previously agreed. He's like, okay, fine. Like, I'll leave Zurich. I won't baptize people anymore in Zurich. But he ends up coming back, and he keeps doing it. And so he becomes the first casualty of this mini theological war, and they actually drown him in the river outside of Zurich.
They drowned Manz?
They drowned Manz.
You know why they didn't burn him at the stake?
Why is that?
Because Man's not hot.
Man's not hot.
I want to press stop on this recording.
He definitely wasn't hot while he was at the bottom of the river.
Drowned him. Gosh dang.
Yeah.
I'd rather get burned, I think.
So right after the I don't know if I'd rather be drowned or burned at the stake.
I heard drowning is rough. Like, your body goes into like freak out mode, and your motor sense of your brain goes on fire. It's pretty bad.
I'd rather be beheaded.
Oh, that's of course. Yeah, I'd rather die in my sleep. Like, come on. Just having a nap here. Anyways, I'm sorry.
You're good. So later that year then, a bunch of these Swiss Anabaptists, who became known as the Swiss Brethren, developed their own kind of confession of faith, so to speak. And it's called the Schleitheim Confession. And if you look at what the Schleitheim Confession consists of, it's really not that revolutionary. In fact, it kind of reminds us of some of the, we'll talk more about this later, but some of the groups that are downwind of the Anabaptists would be like the Mennonites, for example. Bless you.
Thank you, sir.
And really what they have is kind of just like a believer's view of baptism. They have a little bit stronger view of excommunication that is a little bit closer to shunning than like how you and I would speak of excommunication.
Sure.
They're pacifists, except for when they're not.
Yeah.
And then they have a strong view of like the priesthood of all believers. So the early Anabaptists like still wanted like elders in the church and pastors, but there's also this emphasis on like the people too, which just kind of goes right along with everything that's going on in the world at this time.
Yeah.
Enlightenment and all that.
And when you think of like brethren churches today, like they're definitely ancestors of that. Like, we both have a dude we love in our city who's a brethren pastor, but we also know that in that denomination, it's not uncommon to not even have a formal pastor because of the emphasis on the people.
Right. Exactly. So probably the craziest part of the Anabaptist story then crops up in Germany just a few years later. And so in 1534, so this is less than 10 years after that fateful night when the first rebaptisms occurred, the Anabaptist movement has picked up speed. There's Anabaptists kind of scattered, throughout Switzerland and Germany. And remember, at the same time as this, like Lutheranism is just taking Germany by storm, and all of these city-states within Germany, all these Lutheran princes are starting to go like, we're Lutherans, and it's intensely political, it's intensely emotional and spiritual, like it's so charged. And there's this one city called Münster, and it's called the Münster Rebellion, which I think is hilarious. But in Münster, Germany, you've got, it starts as radical Lutheranism. So you've got in this city a few Lutherans who are like really radically against the Catholics, which really draws the Anabaptists because they're like even more radical. And it's almost like, if you can imagine, like when you're splitting a log and you've got those like wedges that you can use. It's like a steel wedge. It looks like a piece of pizza almost that you can like stick in the top of the log, and then that's used for splitting the log. That's like what Lutheranism is for the Anabaptists. It's like it gives them the theological underpinnings to kind of start where they want to go, but they want to take it one step or 10 steps farther.
Sure.
So in Münster, what happens is you've got these radical Lutherans who are writing these pamphlets, basically calling people to Münster to come be a part of what they're doing there. And it ends up drawing all of these Anabaptist people who then elect Anabaptist leaders in the city. And now it's a powder keg. And you've got these extremely radical Anabaptists who oust the previous ecclesial authorities that are there, and then they start doing really weird culty stuff, like they start calling Münster the New Jerusalem.
Wow.
Yeah, which is similar to, did this play at all into our conversation that we just had on Montanism? They believed a small town in Asia Minor was going to be the place that Jesus came back and built the temple, I think. Right. And so they're like early, they're millennialists is what they are. They're like, this is it. This is like the new, like we are it. And this is going to be the New Jerusalem. And they basically kind of have this big cult church, and the previous bishop besieges Münster. And so now they're under siege. And there's this really crazy thing that happens where the guy who was kind of the leader of them, he saw himself as like this modern day Gideon figure. And this is where you realize like this version of the Anabaptists really it was like a cult, because he sees himself as a modern day Gideon, and he like marches out against like the army that's besieging them with like 12 people or something like that, thinking that he's going to rout them, and they just kill him. They cut off his head.
Oh my gosh.
They put it on a spear so that everybody in the city can see it. They cut off his genitals and they nail it to the city door. Wow. And now everybody else is in the city, and again, they're just kind of galvanized by this, it seems like.
I can see why that wasn't the most popular door nailing story from the Reformation.
From the Reformation,
Yeah. You hear a lot about door nailings, but not that one,
I've got so many jokes, but
try and not get flagged as explicit on Spotify.
Yeah. They did some other stuff too, like in this city where they went through and they baptized like 1,000 people again. They went into the old churches and they're destroying all of the icons.
Holy
it's
moly.
like a mob.
Yeah. I think to give our listener a little bit of an idea of the scale. So we were talking about like Germany kind of becoming like rapidly Lutheran, but remember, all of these countries, all of these nations were still under the Holy Roman Empire at the time. Right. So it's not like Germany was its own autonomous nation as we recognize it today. So it's almost like, imagine if the United States was not a democratic republic, but an empire, and imagine that like in Arizona and in Texas and in Colorado and in North Carolina, there are these like rebellions where they decide like they're no longer going to listen to the authorities of the United States, but they're all different, because in France you're going to have the Calvinists, and in England you're going to have the Anglicans. There's so many splintering factions, and you've got those who are like Lutherans who are still sort of sympathetic to like Catholic doctrine, and then you've got the Anabaptists who are radically unsympathetic to anything Catholic. Just imagine what that's going to do to the social atmosphere. Oh yeah. I think we do well to celebrate how beautiful the Reformation was, but you also have to think this is such a drastic social upheaval that, one day we'll talk about the 30 Years' War. There's going to be a ton of bloodshed that's going to happen as a result of this, because just as Tommy said, when religion and politics are inseparable, you can't separate from your community of faith without making a political social statement of rebellion. And so when that happens, you're going to have Catholics fighting Calvinists, and Calvinists fighting Lutherans, and Lutherans fighting Calvinists, and
all of them fighting Anabaptists.
And I think the Anabaptists were the least organized, right? Because this is my understanding, correct me if I'm wrong, the Anabaptists did have a confession, but because they were basically a splinter group, they didn't have the same organization, the Lutherans and the I'll say the Huguenots, because I'm not sure if they were completely Calvinist at this point, but so the Anabaptists were just kind of like these rogue groups that were often kind of stepped on, which is kind of why a lot of the pacifist movements were kind of spawned out of Anabaptists, right?
Right, and I'll talk about that in a minute of kind of why they ended up being more pacifist, and I think it has a lot to do with this situation in Münster.
Okay.
I feel like I should mention, just in case it wasn't clear, the bishop that came back and cut the head off of that Anabaptist leader, that was a Roman Catholic bishop priest, or not. I'm sorry, not bishop priest, a bishop prince. So this is just how unified everything was. This guy was both the civil leader and the church leader of this city.
Yeah.
And so that's why we see him after he's gotten kicked out. He comes back, he besieges it on behalf of the Holy Roman Empire, and he's trying to shut down what's going on. So this wasn't like a Lutheran bishop that got kicked out who's coming back and fighting back in this way. They end up being the siege ends, the Anabaptists are crushed, and they never have the same unity like they had in Münster ever again. One of the interesting characters that we see pop up around this time is a guy by the name of Menno Simons.
Oh, that's my great grandfather.
Which is where we get the Mennonites. And so Menno was a guy he joined the Anabaptist movement, but not because he was this extremely radical dude. He was just kind of a pious fellow who was like, I don't think I see infant baptism in the Bible. Yeah. And so the only place really for him was the Anabaptist movement. He ended up influencing it massively, and he was more pacifist, partially because he had seen some of just the violence and bloodshed that had occurred.
That's interesting.
From this. And I don't know a ton about Menno Simons or how the Mennonite movement ends up taking form. Should probably have someone actually from That'd tradition to come talk about that.
Yeah.
But after this, I mean, basically what happens is they kind of become Anabaptists become the whipping boy of everybody else, for better or for worse. I mean, if you read like Calvin's Institutes or some early Lutheran writings, the Calvinists and Lutherans are actually using Anabaptists to appeal to the Roman authorities and say, like, listen, like, we're not them. Like,
right.
we don't believe this. We don't believe that. Like, we're just trying to reform the true faith. Calvinists and Lutherans are together saying, like, no, the Anabaptists have taken it too far.
And on the flip side, the Catholics are looking at the Anabaptists and saying, look at what you started.
Right.
Like, this is the fruit of what you guys have done by separating from... By being schismatics, basically. Right.
And the Catholics especially are probably the most prone to actually kill the Anabaptists. In fact, King, or the Holy Roman Emperor, I believe it was Ferdinand, he... it's Ferdinand the First. He institutes the practice of... drowning the Anabaptists, and he calls it the third baptism.
That's so freaking messed up.
He's like, you want to be baptized twice? How about 3 times?
Yeah. 3 times the charm.
And really, that literally was. He's like, it's the remedy for Anabaptism. Here's your third baptism.
That's right. You're just one baptism shy.
Yeah.
Oh man, that's brutal. So we as we're kind of tracing lineages here, we can see kind of a connection to the Brethren Church, which is also the Friends Church, because they're, I know, very related. We're seeing the Mennonites, who I know will kind of birth the Amish movement, that I think is more of a familiar term. What other lineages? Because I know we talked about this a little bit, like, is it fair to say that your average Baptist dude has a connection to the Anabaptist movement, or did they deviate somewhere in a different tradition?
Yes and no. Okay. So the Anabaptists ultimately become a very like sectarian type of Christianity, almost kind of like the Desert Fathers, if we're looking very charitably on them, where they're just like, we're just going to withdraw. Like we see such a distinction between like the church and like the world, and the church and the state, that we are going to form our own communities.
They're like
basically.
the Essenes.
Yes. Yeah. So that's kind of where that movement tapers off. And I mean, when you have movements that don't want to engage with culture, they don't really have long-lasting influential effects, in my opinion.
Sure.
I mean, I'm from a tradition that thinks that we should engage massively with culture around us. So obviously, you know, that's my view. Baptists, whether or not they are part of the Anabaptist tradition. In one way, it's hard to say no, because Baptists, by definition, are Anabaptists. Now, I know some Baptists who would disagree with me on that. I find not a whole lot of like uniformity across like even the Southern Baptist tradition on the topic of Anabaptism. Like, I know of churches where if you come to them and you were baptized in a Roman Catholic church as an infant, they would want you to be rebaptized. But if you were baptized as a Lutheran as an infant, they wouldn't necessarily force you to.
Yes.
So I find I don't find a lot of uniformity, I guess would be the word.
Well, I guess when I think of Baptists, and maybe this is just, I mean, Tucson's a big SBC, Southern Baptist Convention town. I don't see uniformity in Baptists at all. Like I don't see common creeds that unify their doctrine. Like I know that in a lot of Baptist circles, there's no-nos and there's kind of unwritten rules, but it's not like this is how we function explicitly. I don't know. There's a lot of autonomy.
You've got different kinds of Baptists today.
Sure.
You know, you've got the Baptist Faith and Message 2000 folks. You've got Reformed Baptists, and to look really charitably on our Baptist friends and not directly connect them with Anabaptists, Baptists probably have their origins more strongly coming out of England, where again, you've got like the Anglican Church, you know, breaking off from the Catholic Church, and then there's still problems within Anglicanism, and so you have two groups arising out of that. You've got the Puritans who are going to try to stay in the Anglican Church and reform it from within, and then you have the English separatists, which end up being Baptists who want to kind of. They're like, we're going to need to do a new thing. That's
interesting. So around the time that the Reformation is kicking off in England, you've got, of course, the Catholics, you've got the Anglicans, who all the Puritans think are just closet Catholics, and then you've got those who are even farther separated, who are kind of like, we've just got to kind of hit reset on it.
Right.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think one of the reasons why it's compelling to think that Anabaptists and Baptists share a common lineage is they do seem to have that emphasis on autonomy. When you look at how a Baptist church functions compared to, say, like a Presbyterian church, one emphasizes autonomy a lot more. One would emphasize being part of a larger community of churches more. And then kind of obviously the believer's baptism thing. But I also think when you do look at it directly, we can see the Mennonite line, we can see the Friends and the Brethren church line, we can see how things like separation from, because when you're talking about how the Anabaptists kind of took the Essenes route of kind of building their own community, like that is the Mennonites, that is the Amish. Like they build their own communities very separate from the world. They don't vote, like they're very just disconnected from that. And so I don't know. I can see how Baptists and the historical Anabaptists can kind of like share similar values, but also it does make sense.
Yeah. There's an emphasis on independence, but also the Baptists like that we have today are way more connected to the Reformation in that they are emphasizing justification by faith.
Yes.
They're not trying to just scrap nearly every development of the church over 2,000 or not 2,000, but 1,500 years.
Yeah.
You've got the Anabaptists are in many ways kind of like the anarchists, where the Baptists are more like, I like to think of the early Baptists, and even a lot of Baptists today, they're more like just the Reformation people who just don't think that we should baptize babies.
Yeah, because Baptists will still say once saved, always saved, even though
Depends
a lot
on
of
the Baptist, but yeah.
Right. I mean, yeah, I'd say my consensus through experience. But yeah, like a lot of them will lean on ideas like sola scriptura, very reformational, like justification by faith. But yeah,
well,
no,
if you
I
think
can
about
see
like
that.
around 130 years after this, 150 years after this, you've got the 1689 London Baptist Confession, which we know churches that subscribe to the 1689. The 1689 is, if I'm not mistaken, essentially the Westminster,
Right.
kind of redone to reflect Baptist convictions.
Sure.
And so Reformed Baptists, London Baptists, tracing their lineage, to England, are very much in the Reformation tradition, kind of walking side by side, I would say, with like the Puritans and the Reformed.
Sure.
Whereas the Anabaptists were like left turn, like 150 years before.
Yeah. No, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah. Yeah, that's so interesting to me. And I don't know. The Anabaptists were, I have a good friend who I think was attracted to the more explicitly Anabaptist tradition, because I think that like it's almost like, because Anabaptists today, the people that follow that lineage, they're not the punk rock, violent, aggressive Anabaptists of that first couple generations. Most of them, I think, have responded to the violence that they provoked, and they've taken a very like pacifist,
Right.
disengaged, like have a very removed relationship with the magistrate compared to other traditions. And I don't know, I find that really, really interesting. I can't say I'm like utterly compelled by it, but I do think that seeing a church tradition that witnessed so much bloodshed in the aftermath of the Reformation and kind of said, listen, we're just not going to do this anymore.
This might be a way too overly simplistic way of putting it, but I just think about what would go on even in the subconscious of people in a movement where like the bright shining day of your movement was making big claims about the millennial reign and being like, this is the new Jerusalem, this dude's the new Gideon, like, and you're making claims like that, and then it all gets crushed.
Yep.
It's like you were saying on our last episode with Montanus, like when you're making like claims and predictions and prophecies that don't come true, like kind of makes your movement fizzle out.
Yeah.
And so it's not that the Anabaptists fizzled out completely, because people still had really strong convictions about baptism, as well as just wanting to divorce themselves from the Roman Catholic Church completely.
Yeah.
Like they weren't interested in reforming the church. They just wanted something new and entirely. So once the radical people all got killed, now you've got the people who are still very they have strong convictions. They're just not trying to like kill everybody over it.
Right.
And that's kind of where we get what we have today.
Which is ironic too, because Zwingli, the first Anabaptists were those who kind of spit in Zwingli's face and kind of did their own thing. But the irony is that Zwingli would take the sword against the Catholics and the Roman Empire, and he would lose his life and much of his tradition, and that part of the Reformation lineage would not necessarily be lost, but definitely severely damaged because of that. And I remember reading that Martin Luther, who was very, very critical of a lot of Zwingli's theology, was also critical of saying, like, look, like Martin Luther was expecting to be martyred. And so the fact that he saw Zwingli kind of take up arms and then lose, he was kind of like, dude, you kind of embarrassed yourself. So taking up the sword during the Reformation just seemed to be an L across the board.
Yeah, it's interesting. It had its pros and cons at different times depending on how it was done. Like
Sure.
the whole, we'll talk sometime about the the Augsburg Confession. Probably we should have Palmer on to talk about that.
That'd be a good idea.
But, in that instance, you just have a bunch of Lutheran princes who are standing up together, and they're not just automatically fighting back against the Holy Roman Emperor, but they're saying, we're pretty serious about this, and we're gonna stand together. So fascinating time of history. Like I said, it's truly a woven web. And so this is just a piece of it.
Well, dude, it's like, you and I both kind of were raised in a pretty general Baptist like household, and then we've both through school and through relationships and through church kind of have leaned more into like a Reformed movement. Like, neither of us had to risk our lives to do that, but this was literally a time where your theological conviction was going to spell out very significantly for what your life looked like, and it could look like not being welcome in the place that you live all of a sudden. And that's
best case scenario.
Best case scenario. It could look like straight up execution. So yeah, it's rough stuff. The Reformation, dude, is such a well of interesting stuff to talk about it, and yeah, I don't know. We're just barely scratching the surface.
Yep.
So cool, man.
Well, thanks for joining along.
Yeah, thanks for listening, guys. We'll catch you guys real soon.
God bless you.
Yeah.